She gripped her resignation letter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Palmer knew the rules of the underworld. You don't just walk away from a man like Linwood Falcone. As a plus-size maid who had seen entirely too much, she thought her invisibility was her shield. But when she reached for the heavy oak door to leave his mansion forever, a massive, scarred hand slammed it shut. "You aren't going anywhere," he whispered into her ear. Palmer Howard possessed a superpower that no one in comic books ever talked about. She was invisible. She wasn't literally transparent, of course. In fact, physically, Palmer took up more space than most people. She was a fat woman. She didn't shy away from the word, nor did she dress it up with polite euphemisms like curvy, big-boned, or Rubenesque. At 280 pounds with a soft, round stomach, broad shoulders, and thick, heavy thighs, Palmer knew exactly how the world perceived her. Society had a funny way of looking right through women of her size, treating them as part of the furniture, background characters in the grand, glamorous movie of everyone else's lives. For the past 5 years, Palmer had turned this societal slight into a lucrative career, working for pristine domestic services, an elite and highly discreet cleaning agency run by a ruthless perfectionist named Beatrice Hayes. Palmer was the woman you called when you needed a sprawling estate scrubbed top to bottom without a single word spoken to the press. Her size made the wealthy, beautiful elite comfortable. They didn't see her as a threat, a temptation, or even a person capable of judging their bizarre, hidden lives. She was simply the help. That was how she ended up at the secluded, sprawling cliffside estate in Montauk, New York, owned by a man named Linwood Falcone. Linwood was officially listed in Forbes as an importer of fine Italian textiles and a venture capitalist. The reality, which Palmer deduced within her first 48 hours of scrubbing the mahogany baseboards of his mansion, was vastly different. Venture capitalists did not have armed guards patrolling the rose gardens. Textile importers did not have a soundproof basement level with a drain in the center of the concrete floor. Palmer kept her head down. She wore her crisp black and white maid's uniform, specially tailored to fit her large frame, though the apron strings always dug uncomfortably into her waist, and focused entirely on her work. She scrubbed, polished, and swept, her heavy breathing echoing in the cavernous, empty halls of the estate. Her body ached at the end of every day, her swollen feet throbbing inside her orthopedic black shoes. But the pay was an astronomical $300 an hour. She needed the money. Her mother's medical bills back in Albany were piling up, threatening to drown them both in debt. During her first 2 weeks, Linwood Falcone was merely a ghost in sharp, bespoke suits. He was a terrifyingly handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp jawline and eyes as black as crude oil. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a panther. Whenever he was in the room, the air pressure seemed to drop. His staff was terrified of him. The guards barely breathed when he walked past. Palmer did what she always did. She blended into the wallpaper. She made herself as small as a fat woman possibly could, until the morning she found the blood. It was a Tuesday. Palmer was tending to Linwood's private study, a room lined with rare books and smelling of expensive scotch and leather. She was running a microfiber cloth over the heavy oak desk when she noticed it. A dark, rust-colored stain soaking into the intricate threads of a priceless Persian rug near the fireplace. Next to the stain, half hidden under a velvet armchair, was a discarded shell casing. Her heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. She stared at the stain. Her first instinct was to run, to call Beatrice Hayes and demand a transfer. But the medical bills flashed in her mind. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Palmer went to her cart. She pulled out the heavy-duty enzyme cleaner, a scrub brush, and a bucket of cold water. Dropping heavily to her knees, her joints popping in the quiet room, she began to scrub. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just worked, the muscles in her thick arms burning as she eradicated the evidence of whatever violent act had occurred here hours prior. "You don't ask questions, do you?" Palmer gasped, her scrub brush slipping from her soapy gloved hand. She spun around, clumsily landing on her bottom. Linwood Falcone was leaning against the doorframe of the study. He had shed his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a sliver of a dark, sprawling tattoo on his chest. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid, watching her with a gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing against her skin. "Mr. Falcone," Palmer stammered, scrambling awkwardly to get her large body back on her feet. Her face burned with humiliation. She always hated being caught off balance. It made her feel ungraceful, monstrous. I apologize. I was just cleaning," he finished for her. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the floorboards. He stepped into the room, his eyes dropping to the damp spot on the Persian rug where the blood used to be, then to the shell casing sitting on the edge of her cleaning cart. Most maids would have run screaming to the police, or at the very least, fainted. Palmer swallowed hard, smoothing down her apron over her stomach. "I am paid to clean, sir, not to scream." Linwood walked closer. Palmer's instinct was to step back, but she forced her heavy legs to remain planted. He stopped mere inches from her. She had to tilt her head up to look at him. Up close, he smelled of bergamot, gunpowder, and danger. His dark eyes slowly dragged over her. Usually, when men looked at Palmer, their eyes slid off her quickly, dismissively, or lingered with a flicker of polite pity. But Linwood didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her the way a man looks at a locked safe, wondering what was inside. He took in her flushed, round face, the heavy curve of her breasts beneath the uniform, and the solid stance of her hips. He didn't sneer. "Palmer, isn't it?" he asked softly. "Yes, sir." "You did a good job, Palmer," Linwood murmured, taking a sip of his drink without breaking eye contact. "Keep doing your job, and keep your mouth shut, and you will find I am a very generous man." He turned and walked away, leaving Palmer trembling in the center of the study, entirely aware that she was no longer invisible. Over the next month, Palmer's life at the Montauk estate shifted in subtle, unnerving ways. Linwood Falcone was watching her. It wasn't overt, but she felt his presence everywhere. When she was on her hands and knees, polishing the marble floors of the foyer, she would look up and see him standing on the mezzanine, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his dark eyes tracking the heavy, rhythmic movements of her body. When she struggled to lift a particularly large stack of firewood, one of his terrifying armed guards would suddenly appear, wordlessly taking the load from her, clearly acting on orders. The most jarring change, however, was the food. Palmer was used to eating in the cramped staff kitchen, subsisting on cold sandwiches and whatever leftovers the private chef deemed unworthy of the master's table. But 3 weeks after the incident in the study, the chef, an uptight Frenchman named Henri, began delivering covered silver platters directly to Palmer's small quarters in the basement. "Mr. Falcone's orders," Henri had sniffed, placing a plate of rich, creamy lobster risotto and a massive slice of tiramisu on her tiny desk. Palmer had been terrified to eat it at first, suspecting some cruel joke. But the food kept coming. Fresh pastries from a famous Italian bakery in the city. Heavy, decadent cuts of prime rib. Linwood was feeding her. It was a bizarre, intimate gesture that left Palmer deeply confused. He knew she was fat. He was actively encouraging it, making sure she was nourished, respected, and full. The tension finally snapped the night of the dinner party. Linwood was hosting a summit of sorts. The estate was crawling with even more guards than usual. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway. The guest of honor was Romano, the boss of a rival syndicate from Chicago. Was a notoriously vicious man, flashy and arrogant, draped in gold chains and reeking of cheap cologne. Palmer was assigned to help serve dinner in the grand dining room. She hated serving. Her large body made navigating between the heavy antique chairs difficult, and she was always terrified of bumping into someone. The atmosphere in the dining room was toxic, the air thick with veiled threats and false laughter. Linwood sat at the head of the long table, a mask of cold indifference on his face, while held court, loudly boasting about his territorial expansions. "It's about trimming the fat, Linwood," sneered, stabbing a piece of steak with his fork. "You gotta cut the dead weight if you want to survive in this economy." Palmer approached Ez's side of the table to pour his wine. Her hands were shaking slightly. She was hyper-aware of her own size in the opulent room, her thighs rubbing together beneath her skirt, sweat beading on her forehead. As she reached over to fill his glass, suddenly leaned back, his elbow violently clipping Palmer's hip. The heavy crystal wine bottle slipped from her grasp. It shattered against the edge of the mahogany table, sending dark red wine splashing across the white linen tablecloth and onto's expensive silk trousers. The dining room plunged into a deathly silence. Palmer froze, her heart stopping. I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. She immediately grabbed a linen napkin and reached out to dab at the spill. Stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. "Get your filthy hands off me, you clumsy bitch!" he roared. Palmer recoiled, pulling her arms tightly around her stomach, trying to make herself smaller. Looked her up and down, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure disgust. "Jesus Christ, Linwood, where did you find this fat cow? Is she the maid or the livestock? No wonder she can't hold a bottle. Her fingers are like sausages." The cruelty in his words hit Palmer like a physical blow. The familiar, crushing weight of shame washed over her. She stared at the floor, tears burning the back of her eyes, wishing the ground would open up and swallow her whole. "Apologize to her." The voice sliced through the room like a razor blade. It was quiet, completely devoid of emotion, yet it made the hair on the back of Palmer's neck stand up. She looked up. Linwood had not moved from his seat. His hands were resting flat on the table. He was staring at, his black eyes utterly dead. Laughed awkwardly, looking around at his own men. "What? You're joking, right?" "This whale ruined my suit." Linwood moved with blinding speed. In one fluid motion, he was out of his chair, crossing the length of the table. Before could even blink, Linwood had a silver steak knife pressed directly against the rival boss's jugular vein. "I don't repeat myself," Linwood whispered, his face inches from the other man's. "You will look at my maid, and you will apologize for your disrespect, or I will open your throat right here, and she will have to clean your blood out of my carpet, and she works hard enough already." Swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing against the sharp edge of the blade. The bravado vanished from his eyes, replaced by stark terror. He looked at Palmer, his face pale. I'm sorry," choked out. Linwood held the knife there for 3 agonizing seconds longer. Then he lowered it. He turned to Palmer, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Go to your room, Palmer. You are done for the night." She fled. She ran down the back stairs as fast as her heavy legs could carry her, locking the door to her small basement room and collapsing onto the narrow bed, sobbing violently into her pillow. She was terrified. Linwood had almost murdered a man over an insult. He was a monster. Hours later, long past midnight, Palmer crept out of her room to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As she passed the air vent that connected to Linwood's basement office, she heard voices. "Crossed the line?" Linwood's voice echoed through the metal grate, cold and clinical. "He thinks Chicago can push into my ports. The disrespect at dinner was just a symptom of his arrogance." "What's the play, boss?" asked another voice. Marco, Linwood's terrifying underboss. "We hit him tomorrow night. He's staying at the plaza. Send the cleaners in first. Take out his guards. I want alive when I get there. I'm going to take my time with him." Palmer clapped a hand over her mouth, her blood running cold. She wasn't just working for a criminal. She was working for a murderer who was actively planning a hit. She had heard the target, the location, the exact plan. If Linwood knew she had heard this, he wouldn't protect her. He would bury her. She backed away from the vent, her mind made up. She had to leave. Tonight. Palmer didn't have much to pack. She pulled a faded navy blue duffel bag from beneath her bed and began haphazardly throwing her few belongings inside. 3 pairs of civilian clothes, mostly oversized tunics and stretchy leggings, her toothbrush, a worn copy of a romance novel, and her mother's framed photograph. Her hands shook violently as she zipped the bag shut. She sat at her small desk, pulling out a piece of pristine domestic services stationery. Gripping a pen, she scrawled a hasty note. "Mr. Falcone, a severe family emergency requires my immediate return to Albany. I must resign my position effective immediately. Thank you for the employment. Palmer Howard." It was a weak excuse, but it was all she had. She just needed a head start. If she could make it to the Montauk train station by dawn, she could disappear back into the safety of the working-class masses. She would change her phone number, move her mother to a different facility, and vanish. It was 4 a.m. The mansion was wrapped in profound silence. Palmer hoisted the heavy duffel bag over her shoulder. It dug painfully into her skin, but adrenaline fueled her movements. She crept out of her basement quarters, moving with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot to her heightened senses. She navigated the labyrinthine hallways, bypassing the staff kitchen and making her way toward the grand foyer. She didn't dare turn on a light, relying on the pale moonlight filtering through the towering, arched windows. Her breathing was ragged, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew the rules of the underworld, even if she had only observed them from the periphery. You don't just walk away from a man like Linwood Falcone. But as a plus-size maid who had seen entirely too much, she prayed her perceived invisibility would act as her shield one last time. She reached the foyer. The massive double-oak front doors were right in front of her. Freedom was 10 feet away. Palmer hurried across the marble floor, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly. She reached out, her trembling fingers grazing the cold brass of the door handle. "Do you know what time it is, Palmer?" The voice came from the shadows to her left. Palmer gasped, a strangled cry escaping her throat, and spun around, dropping her bag. Linwood Falcone was sitting in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the foyer. He was dressed in a pair of dark silk sleep pants and a loose white t-shirt, his bare feet resting on the marble. He held a crystal tumbler of whiskey. In the dim moonlight, he looked like a relaxed, beautiful demon. I... Palmer stammered, backing up until her spine hit the heavy oak door. Linwood stood up slowly. He set the whiskey down on a side table and began to walk toward her. His eyes dropped to the duffel bag on the floor, then to the folded piece of paper trembling in her hand. "What is that?" he asked softly, closing the distance between them. My resignation." Palmer forced the words out, though her voice sounded pathetic and small. She held the paper out. "A family emergency. I have to leave. Now." Linwood didn't take the paper. Instead, he stepped into her personal space. Palmer was a large, solid woman, but Linwood dwarfed her. He was 6'4" of pure, lethal muscle, and his proximity cast a dark, suffocating shadow over her. He reached out, his calloused fingertips lightly brushing against the back of her trembling hand. He gently plucked the resignation letter from her fingers. He didn't even look at it. He just crumpled it up in his massive fist and tossed it over his shoulder. "No," Linwood said. Palmer's breath caught. "Mr. Falcone, you don't understand. I have to go." "I understand perfectly," Linwood replied, his voice a low purr that sent shivers racing down her spine. "I understand that you were awake half an hour ago. I understand that my office vent carries sound directly into your quarters. I understand exactly what you heard." Tears spilled over Palmer's eyelashes. "I swear to God," she sobbed, pressing herself backward against the door. "I won't say a word. I didn't hear anything. Please just let me go. I'm nobody. I'm just the fat maid." Linwood's expression darkened instantly. The terrifyingly calm mask slipped, revealing a flash of raw, aggressive heat. He reached out, his massive hand wrapping around the thick curve of her waist, gripping the soft flesh of her hip with a possessive strength that made her gasp. "Never call yourself that," he snarled softly, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. "You aren't a nobody, and you are magnificent exactly as you are." Palmer froze. The touch, the heat radiating from his body, the intoxicating smell of his skin. It short-circuited her panic, replacing it with a wrinkled, terrifying confusion. "Please," she whimpered, unsure if she was pleading for her life or for something else entirely. She reached behind her back, desperately fumbling for the brass doorknob. She found it. She twisted. Linwood's hand shot out. He didn't grab her wrist. Instead, his large, scarred hand slammed flat against the heavy oak door right beside her head. With his other hand, he reached past her waist and twisted the deadbolt. Click. The sound echoed with fatal finality in the quiet foyer. "You aren't going anywhere," Linwood whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers, burning with a dangerous mix of Mafia ruthlessness and undeniable possessive hunger. "You know too much to leave, Palmer. And even if you didn't, I still wouldn't let you walk out that door." Palmer stared up at the Mafia boss, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She wasn't just a captive of his secrets. She was a captive of him. And as his thumb slowly, deliberately stroked the curve of her hip, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. A part of her didn't want him to open the door. Linwood's hand dropped from the deadbolt, leaving the heavy brass lock engaged with a chilling sense of permanence. He didn't step back to give her space. Instead, he reached down and effortlessly hoisted her cheap, overstuffed navy duffel bag over his broad shoulder. "Come with me," he commanded, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Palmer's legs felt like lead. "Where?" she whispered, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "My room is in the basement." "You don't live in the basement anymore," Linwood replied, turning his back to her and walking toward the grand, sweeping staircase. He paused on the first step, looking over his shoulder when he realized she hadn't moved. "Palmer, walk." Trembling, she peeled herself away from the oak door and followed him. They bypassed the servant stairs entirely, ascending the plush, carpeted main staircase that she had spent hours meticulously vacuuming. Linwood led her down the east wing corridor, a section of the house strictly off-limits to everyone except his inner circle. He pushed open a set of double mahogany doors, gesturing for her to enter. Palmer stepped inside and gasped. The room was the size of her mother's entire apartment back in Albany. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean, the moonlight illuminating a massive king-sized bed draped in silver silk, a roaring fireplace, and an expansive seating area. Linwood dropped her duffel bag onto a velvet chaise lounge. It looked absurdly out of place, a pathetic remnant of her old, invisible life resting in a room built for a queen. "I can't be in here," Palmer said, her voice shaking as she wrapped her arms around her thick waist, instinctively trying to shrink herself. "If Beatrice Hayes finds out, she'll fire me on the spot." "Beatrice Hayes no longer employs you," Linwood said smoothly, walking over to a heavy crystal decanter on a side table and pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid. "I bought pristine domestic services 3 hours ago. Beatrice has been given a generous severance and strict instructions to lose your file. As far as the world is concerned, Palmer Howard resigned and moved to the Midwest." Palmer stared at him, the sheer magnitude of his power rendering her speechless. He had bought an entire company just to erase her tracks? He walked back to her, pressing a cool glass of whiskey into her trembling hand. "Drink. It will settle your nerves." She took a desperate swallow, the alcohol burning a trail down her throat. "Why are you doing this? I heard your plan. I heard you tell Marco you were going to kill Romano at the Plaza Hotel. You should be throwing me in the trunk of a car, not putting me in a guest suite." "Because you are not a liability, Palmer. You are mine to protect," Linwood said softly. He reached into the inner pocket of his robe and pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. He held it out to her. Hesitantly, Palmer set her glass down and took the paper. She unfolded it. It was a receipt from Oak Haven Medical Center in Albany. The balance on her mother's extensive, crippling account was 0. At the bottom, a note was typed. "Account paid in full. Private 24/7 nursing care secured indefinitely." Tears welled up in Palmer's eyes, spilling over her cheeks. The crushing weight of debt that had suffocated her for 3 years was gone in an instant. She looked up at the terrifying Mafia boss, utterly bewildered. "This is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why?" Linwood stepped closer, raising a large, calloused hand to gently wipe a tear from her soft, round cheek. The touch was startlingly tender from a man whose hands were built for violence. "Because you are a woman who breaks her back, cleaning up the filth of people who are beneath you. You let a pig like insult you because you were terrified of losing your paycheck to keep your mother alive. You don't have to carry that weight anymore. I am carrying it now. But I'm your prisoner," she choked out. "You are my guest," Linwood corrected, his dark eyes trailing down the generous curve of her throat, lingering heavily on the swell of her breasts beneath her plain shirt. "You will not leave this estate for your own safety. But you will never pick up a scrub brush again. You will sleep. You will eat whatever Henri prepares for you. You will allow yourself to be taken care of." Before Palmer could formulate a response, Linwood leaned down, pressing a firm, searing kiss to her forehead. The scent of bergamot and danger enveloped her. Lock the door behind me, Palmer. Rest. The next 3 days were a surreal, disorienting blur. Palmer woke up in the silver silk sheets, her heavy body sinking comfortably into a mattress that felt like a cloud. True to his word, Henri the chef sent up extravagant meals: buttermilk pancakes with fresh berries, seared scallops, rich pastas, all delivered by guards who averted their eyes with profound respect. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a massive delivery arrived. 6 women from an elite boutique in Manhattan were escorted into her suite, carrying dozens of garment bags. When Palmer tried to protest, the head stylist smiled warmly. "Mr. Falcone was very specific about your measurements, Miss Howard. He wants you comfortable." For 2 hours, Palmer was draped in the finest fabrics she had ever touched. There were no oversized, shapeless tunics designed to hide her fat body. Instead, there were high-waisted linen trousers that accentuated her wide hips, wrap dresses that hugged her thick waist, and silk nightgowns that clung to her heavy curves. For the first time in her life, clothes were not a punishment. They were in celebration. That evening, Palmer stood in front of the full-length gilded mirror. She wore a deep emerald-green wrap dress that dipped low in the front, the rich color making her skin glow. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She didn't look invisible. She looked lush, powerful, and dangerously beautiful. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Linwood walked in. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, a blood-red tie at his throat, looking every inch the ruthless underboss of the New York syndicate. But when he saw Palmer standing by the mirror, he stopped dead in his tracks. The cold, calculated mask he always wore shattered entirely. His eyes darkened to the color of midnight. He closed the door, his gaze locked onto her as he crossed the room with slow, predatory steps. "Mr. Falcone," Palmer breathed, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the dress hugged her stomach and thighs. "Linwood," he corrected, his voice a gravelly whisper. He stopped just inches away from her. He reached out, his large hands resting on her wide hips, his thumbs lightly tracing the soft indentation of her waist through the silk. "I knew it," he murmured, looking at her reflection in the mirror alongside his own. "I knew they were blind. They looked at you and saw a maid to be ignored. I looked at you and saw a goddess meant to be worshipped." Palmer's breath hitched. "Linwood, I'm fat." "You are spectacular," he growled softly, leaning down to press an open-mouthed kiss against the sensitive skin of her neck. Palmer gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to grip his broad shoulders to steady herself as her knees went weak. "Every soft inch of you, every curve. I've watched you for a month, Palmer. Watching you bend, watching you move, it drove me insane." The confession sent a wild, electric thrill straight to her core. He wasn't fetishizing her. He was seeing her, truly seeing her. His lips trailed up to her jaw, his hands tightening possessively on her hips, pulling her flush against his hard, muscular body. Palmer's mind was spinning. She tilted her head back, leaning into the intoxicating heat of him, ready to surrender to the terrifying, wonderful tension that had been building since the day she found the blood in his study. Knock, knock, knock. The heavy, urgent pounding on the door shattered the moment. Linwood stiffened, a lethal irritation flashing across his face. He pulled back slightly, though he kept one hand firmly planted on Palmer's hip. "What?" he barked. The door opened a crack. Marco stood there, his face grim, a suppressed assault rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't look at Palmer. "Boss, the motorcade is ready. Romano is currently having dinner in the private dining room of the plaza. We have a 30-minute window before his Chicago muscle rotates shifts." The tender, worshipful man who had just been kissing her neck vanished. In his place stood the ruthless Mafia boss. Linwood turned to Palmer, his eyes cold and focused. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Marco. Do you understand?" Palmer nodded, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. "Be careful," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Linwood's expression softened just a fraction. He leaned in, stealing a hard, bruising kiss from her lips that left her dizzy. "I always come back to what is mine," he promised. Then he was gone, the heavy doors shutting behind him. The storm broke just after midnight. Thunder rattled the massive windows of the guest suite, lightning illuminating the churning, violent ocean below. Palmer paced the length of the Persian rug, the emerald silk of her dress swishing around her calves. 4 hours had passed since Linwood left. The mansion was eerily quiet, the silence pressing against her eardrums. She had tried to read, tried to watch television, but her mind was entirely consumed by the image of Linwood stepping into a hotel crawling with heavily armed Chicago mobsters. She wasn't just afraid for him. She was angry at herself. She had spent her whole life avoiding danger, avoiding being noticed. Now she was willingly locked in the bedroom of a murderer, her body humming with the memory of his hands, praying he survived a gangland hit. At 1:15 a.m., the silence was shattered by the screech of tires. Palmer rushed to the window. 3 black SUVs tore up the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the driving rain. One of the vehicles had a shattered windshield. The doors burst open before the cars had fully stopped. Panic seized her chest. She forgot Linwood's strict order to stay in the room. Palmer threw open the double doors and ran down the east wing corridor, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. She reached the top of the grand staircase just as the front doors were kicked open. Marco backed into the foyer, his rifle raised toward the driveway, shouting orders into the rain. Behind him, 2 enormous guards were dragging Linwood through the doorway. Linwood's bespoke suit was ruined. His white shirt was soaked in dark, thick crimson, the blood steadily dripping onto the pristine marble floor. He was pale, his jaw clenched in agony as he leaned heavily on the men. "Get Dr. Rossi on the phone," Marco roared, slamming the front door shut and engaging the steel deadbolts. "Tell him the boss caught one in the flank. Move!" The foyer erupted into chaos. Guards were shouting, weapons were being reloaded, and Henri the chef appeared from the kitchen doorway, looking utterly terrified, carrying a useless stack of white dish towels. Palmer didn't think. The years of cleaning up horrific messes, the quiet resilience she had built from a lifetime of being ignored, took over completely. She practically flew down the stairs. "Put him on the floor!" she yelled, her voice echoing over the shouting men. The guards hesitated, looking at Marco. "I said put him down before he bleeds out standing up," Palmer commanded, shoving her way through a man twice her size. The sheer authority in her tone, coming from a woman they had only ever known as a meek maid, stunned them into compliance. They lowered Linwood onto the floor. He groaned, his head lolling back against the marble. Palmer dropped to her knees beside him. The emerald silk of her expensive dress immediately soaked up the puddle of his blood. But she didn't care. She snatched the towels from the paralyzed chef. "Henri, go to the kitchen. Bring me the strongest alcohol you have and the sharpest paring knife. Marco, where is the doctor?" 10 minutes away, Marco grunted, his eyes wide as he watched her work. "He doesn't have 10 minutes, Palmer muttered. She ripped Linwood's ruined shirt open, exposing the dark, sprawling tattoo on his chest and the jagged, horrific bullet wound tearing through his lower right side. It was a through and through, but the bleeding was massive. She bunched up the thick white towels and pressed her considerable weight directly onto the wound. Linwood let out a ragged, agonizing shout, his eyes snapping open. His gaze was wild, clouded with pain, until it locked onto Palmer's face. "Look at me," she ordered him, pressing harder, her hands slick with his blood. "Stay with me, Linwood. You don't get to buy my mother a nurse and then die on my floor." A weak, bloody smile touched the corner of Linwood's mouth. His large hand reached up, his bloody fingers trembling as they gripped the fabric of her dress at her shoulder. You disobeyed my order," he rasped, his breathing shallow. "I told you to stay locked in the room." "Fire me," she shot back, tears blurring her vision. Henri ran back into the foyer, dropping a bottle of overproof vodka and a knife beside her. For the next 10 agonizing minutes, Palmer kept Linwood anchored to the earth. She used her body weight to stem the hemorrhaging, talking to him constantly, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of chaos around them. By the time Dr. Rossi burst through the doors with his medical bags, Linwood had passed out from the pain, but his pulse was steady. Palmer sat back on her heels, her chest heaving, her hands and dress covered in blood. Marco stepped forward, extending a hand to help her up. The disrespect and dismissal he had shown her in the past were gone, replaced by a profound, deferential awe. She took his hand, hauling her heavy frame up from the floor. "They're taking him to the medical bay in the basement," Marco said quietly, as Dr. Rossi's team loaded Linwood onto a stretcher. "You saved his life, Miss Howard." Palmer wiped a bloody strand of hair from her forehead. "What happened, Marco? You had the drop on." Marco's face darkened, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "We were set up. Someone tipped Chicago off. Wasn't in the dining room. He had 30 men waiting for us in the lobby. We fought our way out, but the boss took a ricochet covering my exit." A cold spike of terror drove itself into Palmer's heart. "Is alive?" Marco spat out the word like poison. "And he knows it was Linwood who ordered the hit." Marco paused, looking away uncomfortably before looking back into Palmer's terrified eyes. "And sent a message through the wire while we were driving back." "What message?" Palmer asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Recognized Linwood's tactics," Marco said gravely. "But he also recognized the timing. He knows Linwood lost his temper at the dinner party because of you. Put out a $2 million bounty on Linwood's head tonight." Marco hesitated, swallowing hard. "And he put a $1 million bounty on the fat maid. His words, not mine." Palmer felt the blood drain from her face. The room spun wildly. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She wasn't just the woman Linwood Falcone desired. She was a high-value target in an all-out Mafia war. And Romano wouldn't rest until the woman who had made him look weak was dead. The sterile, bright lights of the underground medical bay starkly contrasted the opulent shadows of the mansion above. For 48 hours, Palmer refused to leave the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Linwood's bed. She had changed out of the ruined emerald silk, dressing in a simple black sweater and soft leggings, but the ghost of his blood still felt sticky on her hands. The estate was on utter lockdown. Marco had transformed the property into a fortress, tripling the guard detail and placing snipers on the roof. The air inside the house was thick with paranoia and impending violence. The $2 million bounty on Linwood was a beacon for every ambitious hitman on the East Coast, but it was the $1 million price tag on Palmer's head that had truly sent shockwaves through the syndicate. Romano had made a fatal miscalculation. By putting a hit on the Maid, he had inadvertently broadcasted to the entire criminal underworld that the untouchable, ice-cold Linwood Falcone had a vulnerability. He had a heart, and it belonged to the heavy-set, quiet woman, currently wiping a cool washcloth across his feverish brow. On the evening of the second day, Linwood finally stirred. A low, jagged groan ripped from his chest as his dark eyes fluttered open. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, his gaze frantically sweeping the room before locking onto Palmer. The feral panic in his eyes instantly dissolved. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice raw. "I couldn't leave," Palmer whispered, her throat tight with a mixture of overwhelming relief and exhaustion. She reached out, her soft, plump hand gently cupping his jaw. "You locked the door, remember?" A ghost of a smirk played on his pale lips. He shifted, wincing as the painkillers fought a losing battle against the agony of the bullet wound. He reached up, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist, pulling her hand down to press a kiss to her palm. "Marco told me," Linwood murmured, his thumb brushing against her pulse point. "He told me you ordered my men around, that you held my blood inside my body." He paused, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "You saved my life, Palmer." "I was just cleaning up another one of your messes, Mr. Falcone," she replied, trying for a weak joke, but a stray tear slipped down her cheek. Linwood's grip on her wrist tightened, and with surprising strength for a man who had nearly died, he tugged her forward. "Get in," he commanded softly, shifting his large frame to the side of the narrow hospital bed. "Linwood?" "No, you're injured." "I don't care," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a gravelly purr. "Get in this bed, Palmer. I need to feel you. I need to know you are real." Hesitantly, carefully, Palmer slipped her shoes off and climbed onto the mattress. She was hyper-aware of her size, terrified of crushing him or pulling his stitches. But Linwood didn't let her hover on the edge. He wrapped his thick, tattooed arm around her wide waist and pulled her flush against his uninjured side. Palmer let out a shaky breath, resting her head on his shoulder. The steady, strong beat of his heart against her cheek was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "Put a bounty on you," Linwood whispered into her hair, his tone shifting from tender to terrifyingly cold. $1 million. "I know," Palmer said, her hands resting lightly on his chest. "Marco told me. I'm a target." "You are a queen," Linwood corrected fiercely, his fingers tangling in her hair, forcing her to look up at him. "Thinks he can use you to draw me out. He thinks because you are soft, because you are sweet, that you are weak. He doesn't know that my woman has a spine made of titanium." My woman. The word sent a violent, possessive thrill straight to her core. Palmer looked at the Mafia boss, realizing that the invisible Maid was truly dead. In her place was someone entirely new. "How did he know where you were going to be, Linwood?" Palmer asked quietly. "Marco said you were set up." Linwood's jaw clenched. "Someone inside this house fed him my itinerary. Only 3 people knew I was going to the plaza: Marco, myself, and the man who prepared my dinner before I left." Palmer gasped. Henry has a gambling problem," Linwood stated flatly. "And Chicago has deep pockets. Marco is dealing with him as we speak." Palmer squeezed her eyes shut. She was sleeping in the arms of a man who was casually confirming the execution of his private chef. The old Palmer would have run screaming. But the woman lying against Linwood's chest only felt a cold, hard sense of justice. Henry had sold them out. He had nearly gotten Linwood killed. He had put a target on her back. "Do what you have to do," Palmer whispered, opening her eyes and meeting his intense gaze without flinching. Linwood looked at her, absolute worship radiating from his dark eyes. He leaned down and kissed her, deep and bruising, a promise of violence and devotion poured into a single, breathtaking act. "I am going to burn Romano's world to ash," he promised against her lips. "And when the smoke clears, you will be wearing his empire around your neck." The war arrived not with a whisper, but with a deafening roar. It was 3 a.m., 3 days after Linwood had woken up. He was still weak, relying on a cane to walk, but he stubbornly refused to remain in the basement any longer. They were asleep in the silver silk sheets of the master suite when the first explosion rocked the Montauk estate. Palmer jolted upright, a scream caught in her throat as the floorboards vibrated beneath the heavy bed. The mansion's alarms immediately began shrieking, flashing red emergency lights painting the bedroom in a sinister, bloody glow. Linwood was out of bed before she could even process what was happening. He grabbed a heavy Glock 19 from the nightstand, his face a mask of pure, lethal calm, despite the fresh bandages wrapped tightly around his abdomen. "Get up, Palmer! Shoes on, now!" he barked, tossing her a thick robe. Gunfire erupted from the front gates, the staccato popping of automatic weapons echoing off the crashing ocean waves outside the shattered windows. Romano hadn't waited for an assassin to collect the bounty. He had brought a small army to Montauk to finish the job himself. Marco burst through the bedroom doors, his assault rifle raised. "Boss, they blew the front gates with C4. We have at least 40 hostiles storming the driveway. They're heavily armed. Chicago muscle." "Hold the grand staircase," Linwood ordered, grabbing an extra magazine from his dresser. "Do not let them reach the second floor. Where is the fallback?" "The panic room in the west wing, but they've cut the power to the security doors," Marco shouted over the sound of breaking glass below. "If we move through the main halls, we're sitting ducks." Palmer tied her robe tightly around her thick waist, her mind racing. The men were thinking like soldiers, analyzing sight lines and tactical fallbacks. But Palmer thought like a maid. She knew this house intimately. She knew its bones, its flaws, and its secrets. "We don't use the main halls," Palmer said, her voice surprisingly steady. Both men snapped their attention to her. "What are you talking about?" Marco demanded. "The servant corridors," Palmer explained rapidly, grabbing Linwood's arm. "When this house was built in the 1920s, the owners didn't want to see the staff. There is a secondary network of hallways built entirely behind the walls. Beatrice Hayes made me use them to transport laundry, so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetics of the main corridors." She looked at Linwood. "The entrance is behind the linen closet in the east wing. It drops directly into the basement, behind the wine cellar. We can flank them." Linwood stared at her, a ferocious, proud smile breaking through the grim tension of his face. He kissed her hard on the mouth. "Lead the way, Mia Regina." Palmer moved with a desperate, heavy grace. She led Linwood and Marco out of the master suite, dodging the shattering glass as bullets tore through the expensive artwork lining the hallway. She reached the linen closet, throwing open the door and yanking a false panel away to reveal a narrow, pitch-black corridor. "It's a tight squeeze," Palmer warned, immediately ducking inside. For 10 terrifying minutes, they navigated the dusty, spider-web-filled tunnels. Palmer led the charge in the dark, her hands trailing along the rough wooden beams, guiding the ruthless Mafia boss and his deadliest killer through the hidden arteries of the mansion. The muffled sounds of the war, raging in the grand foyer, echoed through the walls. Screams, gunfire, and the tearing of expensive mahogany. They reached the basement drop-off. Palmer pushed the heavy stone door open, stepping out into the cool, dark expanse of the wine cellar. "They breached the foyer," Marco whispered, checking his radio. "My men are pinned down on the staircase. Is inside." Linwood's eyes went dead. He checked the chamber of his Glock. "Stay here, Palmer." "No," she said firmly. She wasn't going to hide in the dark while the man she loved fought for their lives. She picked up a heavy, empty wine bottle from a dusty rack, gripping it by the neck. "I'm not invisible anymore, Linwood. Where you go, I go." Linwood looked at the beautiful, fierce, plus-size woman, holding a wine bottle like a battle axe, and he knew he would burn down the world for her. "Stay behind, Marco," was all he said. They moved silently out of the wine cellar and crept up the servant stairs, emerging directly behind the grand foyer. The scene was absolute carnage. Linwood's men were pinned on the mezzanine, exchanging heavy fire with his crew below. And there, standing in the center of the ruined, blood-stained marble foyer, was Romano. He was wearing a flashy silver suit, barking orders at his men from behind a flipped marble table. "Burn the house down," roared, completely unaware that death was standing 20 feet behind him. "I want Falcone's head, and I want the fat bitch's heart on a platter." Linwood stepped out from the shadows. He didn't shout. He didn't offer a monologue. He simply raised his weapon, but caught the movement in his peripheral vision. The Chicago boss spun around, his eyes widening in shock as he raised his own weapon. He didn't aim at Linwood. He saw the soft green silk of Palmer's robe behind Marco, and his face twisted into a sneer of pure hatred. He aimed directly at Palmer's chest. Bang! The gunshot echoed with a deafening crack. Palmer flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the burning agony. But it never came. She opened her eyes. Romano was staring straight ahead, a perfectly round black hole right between his eyes. The flashy Chicago boss swayed for a moment before collapsing backward, his body hitting the marble floor with a sickening, final thud. Linwood lowered his smoking Glock. His chest heaved as he stared at the corpse of his rival. With their boss dead, the remaining Chicago muscle instantly dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender to the men on the mezzanine. The war was over in a matter of seconds. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Linwood dropped his cane. He ignored the throbbing pain in his side and crossed the bloody marble floor, wrapping his massive arms around Palmer. He buried his face in her neck, breathing heavily, the scent of gunpowder and bergamot washing over her. Palmer wrapped her arms around his broad back, holding him just as tightly. She looked around the ruined foyer. The Persian rugs were destroyed, the crystal chandelier was shattered, and the walls were riddled with bullet holes. It was a catastrophic, bloody mess. But as she squeezed the ruthless Mafia boss tighter against her soft, heavy body, Palmer knew she wouldn't be the one scrubbing the floors this time. She was done cleaning up the underworld. She was ready to rule it. Did Palmer just seal her fate with the most dangerous man in New York? Or is Linwood Falcone about to realize he locked himself in with a woman stronger than he ever imagined? The chemistry between them is explosive, but with a Mafia war brewing and a hit on Romano looming, survival is not guaranteed. If you loved this intense, pulse-pounding start to Palmer and Linwood's dark romance, smash that like button.